Hey guys, this is Nathan and welcome to the Ep4. Today in this Factorio tutorial, we're going to be covering the topic of labs. Now this is an extremely important topic and it is completely required for every Factorio playthrough, so I would be paying attention and make sure you understand what we're going to be talking about today. Just in case you guys were wondering, in the last video I mentioned that I would be taking a break from the electricity stuff and moving to the lab stuff. The information about labs that I'm going to be covering today goes right along with what I'll be talking in the electricity part 2 video. So if you're confused about anything I talk about today, watch that second electricity video and hopefully that'll clear up some of the things that I'm skimming over today. So anyway, let's get into labs and let's start by talking about what it costs to create a lab. Now a lab is located in the production tab of your crafting menu, and as you guys can see, it costs 10 iron gear wheels, 10 electronic circuits, 4 transport belts, and it overall takes 21.5 seconds to make. Now this is one of the longer items that it takes to craft, but it is important to have a couple of these labs pretty soon after you get into electricity. Now thankfully you won't really have to create that many of these. Maybe in total you'll have to create maybe 100 to 200 throughout the entire playthrough. At least once you create them, you won't have to create very many more. So let's talk about how a lab actually works. So labs are the lifeblood of progression in this game. Without a lab you cannot progress, and that is because they consume science packs of varying types and qualities to create research for you. And this research unlocks new things, new items, new ways to make technology and streamline the process. Also, it's good to know that you have to use labs to finish the game. It is ultimately impossible to complete and beat the game without using labs. So in case you wanted to try to figure a way around them, you really can't. You have to use them at some point. Now the nice thing is they work pretty simply. You have the science packs inserted into them and they require power to run, and then they do the research for you. Now thankfully you get to choose what research you want to do. If you press the T key, it opens up the research menu. And as you guys may have noticed in the top right, there has always been a press T to start new research button right there. And of course, we've got a bunch of stuff to look at in our research center. What you guys should know, at least for now, I'll get into it some later, is the things that we can research are those in yellow. And obviously those have a certain price associated with them. In this case, the cost is 10 science packs to research automation. And the effects or the rewards from finishing that research is getting an assembly machine and a long-handed inserter. Those are both topics for another day. I'll cover a lot of this research stuff in future episodes of the tutorial series. It's also good to know that each research tier usually unlocks another research tier. So for example, once I do automation, it unlocks electronics for me, and pretty much every one of these will unlock one or more branching stages of research. So it's a complicated system for sure. The way that you start research is just to click on what you want to do and click the research button. What's interesting is you can start the research and nothing will happen unless you fuel and set up the labs properly. So as you can see, automation has been started, but there's no progress going for that. So as I mentioned before, these labs do require power. Once this lab is connected to the power grid, you can see that it has an electricity bar and electricity consumption, and you can see that the electricity bar is full. So the second thing that the lab needs to function are science packs that match the requirements for the research that we're trying to do. In this case, we need 10 science packs. All of the science packs will show up under intermediate products in the crafting menu, and I'm just going to be crafting 10 of these science pack number ones. I call them red potions or red science packs because that's just kind of what they look like. These science packs are actually pretty cheap to make, but they do take kind of a long time to craft manually. It only takes 1 copper plate and 1 iron gear wheel to craft, and it does take a total time of 5.5 seconds. So it's kind of annoying to craft these manually, but resource intensity wise, it's very cheap. So once we have these science packs, or at least a few of them, you place them inside of the lab. And as you guys can see, progress is starting to be done on the research that we selected. Of course, we can add more science packs in whenever, and that will just continue the research process. So once research has been started, it pretty much comes down to a waiting game. Your lab has to go through all 10 of those science packs in order to finish the research and unlock the new materials and items for you to be able to use. Now, some of you guys may be thinking this is a really tedious way to do research, and unfortunately, at least for starting, it is kind of tedious. Now, there is a way to speed this up. I'm not going to be going into a really good setup now, but if you place more than one lab, you can actually double the speed of the research by having both of these work on the research at one time. For now, I'm going to let this single lab finish out the research that we have started, but in a couple minutes, I'm going to be showing you guys a setup that allows multiple labs to consistently efficiently work on a single research at the same time, and this really speeds up the process by quite a bit. Alright, so now that our research has finished, you see it's giving us a nice sound cue there, and it's got a nice flashing sign right here. And as you guys can see, the finished research will now appear at the bottom as a green slot here. And of course, as we mentioned before, automation unlocked electronics for us, and we can now research electronics. Now, we're not going to do that now. There's one other thing that we need to research before we can move on in this video, and that's logistics. Now, this research is a little bit more expensive. It costs 20 science packs, and actually, for the sake of time, I will set up a couple more of these lab stations and we'll have them work on it together. That'll speed up the process for us a lot, make it a little bit more time efficient for us as well. Now, something to keep in mind is the more labs you have set up working on something, the more electricity you're going to be consuming. So you do need to start balancing those things with your electricity setup. You may need to expand your electricity setup. And of course, I will be going over the expansion of electricity in the next video or so. So I'm going to start putting in science packs into each one of these. I'm going to be putting in 2 into each one, and that should give us a much faster research time when it comes down to it. I do need 20 total science packs to be used up in this process, so I will keep adding science packs to each of these labs as they are going through what they already have. And of course, just like the last time, this process is kind of tedious. There's really no other way around it unless you just expand your lab setup to where you have more labs working on it. So now that our research has finished, we now have unlocked logistics, and this actually unlocks one important thing for this video anyway, and that is the underground belt. So I'll be introducing the underground belt to you guys today, and essentially let's go over the cost for creating it. It costs 10 iron plate and 5 transport belts with a total of 3.5 seconds to create. Now, I'll be creating a couple of these. Generally, you don't have to create that many. Also, something to note is that each one of these gives you 2 underground belts, but it does this for a very good reason. A single underground belt by itself does not do you much good. So for example, if I place a single underground belt, it sends the stuff underground, but it doesn't ever come out of the ground. As you guys have already seen, normal belts are pretty reliable. They just move an object from one place to another. An underground belt does something very similar to that, except it moves it underground. Who would have guessed? Also, something to keep in mind is that as the items are traveling underground, you cannot see them. So don't be alarmed that your items are disappearing underground. They will eventually turn up on the other side. Other nuances about them, you actually can press R when touching an underground belt, and it will change the direction that the underground belt goes. Similar to the underground pipes, as you guys may have noticed from last video, these underground belts, the sides are picked up one at a time, and in order to connect them properly, the sides have to be facing the correct orientation, otherwise it doesn't work. These are of course variable. You can place each end as close to each other as you want, but they do have a maximum distance, and for a normal underground belt, the maximum distance is 6 blocks across from one end to the other. So definitely keep that in mind when you're trying to use these in some sort of complicated setup. Also, something that's interesting is if you have multiple items on the underground belt and you pick up one of the ends, it doesn't matter. It will put all of those items that were on that underground belt into your inventory, so you don't actually waste any objects when you pick up an underground belt that has stuff on it. Alright, so how do underground belts relate to our lab setup? And that's a very good question. So we need to set up labs in such a way that we can stack multiple of them in a space efficient way, as well as we got to provide science packs to all of them in an automated fashion. Now, this will of course involve using transport belts, and today I'm going to be showing you a setup that I didn't actually create. It was created by my brother. He improved on one of my previous setups by a ton, so this setup is probably one of the best I've ever seen, and I highly suggest you guys using it. Alright, so this is how the basic setup goes. We're going to take 2 of these labs and place them right next to each other, and then we're going to take another lab and place it one space away from the other lab. So what we're going to do is we're going to have inserters taking from the first lab and placing into the second lab. Now, you guys may not understand how these inserters work. If you guys are curious about that, please watch the next video. That will be my electricity part 2 video where I'll explain exactly how those work. I'm sure you guys have a general idea of how they work already. Alright, so this is the basic lab setup. And as you guys can see, this is of course expandable. Once I have some of these other labs crafted, I will be able to stack those on end behind the labs that we already have. So how does it work? Well, there's actually two parts to it. So first of all, this circular belt allows us to evenly distribute science packs that we have created so that they don't stack up on one end of the track. So for example, if we had the track not circular, this would end up happening. Now these science packs are still available to this farther row of labs, but they are no longer available to this closer row of labs. So in order to combat that, if we create a circle, these science packs will eventually circle back around to where they're available for pickup by both rows of these labs. Generally, the circular setup is one of the best ways to evenly distribute resources. Of course, they're not very space efficient, and they do take up quite a bit more transport belts than if you were to do just a normal straight line. But I would highly suggest this, especially for your lab setup. So what we're going to do is we're going to load this track with a bunch of these science packs so that there's a bunch available for these labs to take from. Now that we have our other labs, I'm just going to stack them on the end here. And as you guys can see, this setup is pretty modular. You can just keep on adding rows after rows, and it expands very nicely. Also, you will have to keep power to these rows, which in and of itself is not too bad either. All you have to do is put one normal power line on each section. So all of those are powered and they're ready to go. So the second part of this setup has to do with how labs work. Now, labs store extra science packs inside of themselves as a buffer. This allows the inserters that are outside of the first lab to take from that buffer and insert those into the second lab. In the same way, the second lab will also build up a buffer, which will allow this inserter to take from that second lab and insert it into the third lab. This goes on and so forth, and so this should mean that you can stack almost infinite number of labs on end. Now, there is one limitation. The speed at which these inserters can insert will slow the effective amount of labs that you can have in a row. I would stick to probably 8 to 10 labs in a row if you're going to try to max it out. Of course, there are some other ways to get around that. You can add more inserters or make them faster. Those are definitely topics for another day though. So let's see what this lab setup looks like when we start some research. So let's do some optics research. That's a pretty fast one. It only takes 10 science packs. And once we start this, as you guys can see, they will start chaining off science packs one to another and start feeding those down to the last labs in this setup. Now, of course, if we had more science packs on this belt, it would be a little bit more efficient. But with the limited resources we have now, this is about the best that we can do. Once, of course, each of these labs fills up its buffer, they will keep loading in new science packs from the belt and eventually should all be working. As you guys noticed, that optics research finished pretty quick, and that's because we had a total of 8 labs working on it at the same time. So do keep in mind, the more labs you have, once again, the faster the research will go. But of course, you'll have to supply all of those with science packs. So this is the general setup. Of course, it can be expanded. And one last thing you should consider when placing down labs is how much space you will potentially need. Now, this area is probably not the best to make a big lab setup because eventually we're going to be encroaching into our power production, which is arguably more important than the labs themselves. The lab setup is also very close to our iron setup, which we will be improving in the next electricity video. So we probably should end up setting our lab setup somewhere out up here in the north where we've got a lot of room. This will of course mean that we have to pipe our science packs farther to get to the lab, but it's definitely worth it because you're saving space and making it a bit more efficient. Now, you may be asking yourself, how do underground belts relate to this? And yes, I haven't gotten to that part quite yet. As you guys can see, we've got a single track that is supplying science packs to all of these labs. Well, what happens when we have to provide multiple science packs? For example, green science packs and red science packs. There should be a way to provide both of those to all of those labs. Otherwise, we can't complete the research. The way that you have to do this is load up one half of the track with one type of science pack and the other half of the track with the other type of science pack. Of course, you guys should be familiar with how these tracks work. You can definitely separate 2 different types of resources on each side of the track. But how do we get the greens on the inside? It's simple enough to load the reds onto the outside. All you have to do is set up a track something like this, and those should automatically load themselves exclusively onto the outside of the track. The inside of the track gets a little bit trickier, and this is where we have to use the underground belts. So this is how we're going to do it. We're going to take an underground belt and we're going to send it right inside of this loop. Then we're going to loop it around and connect it right on the inside of the track. And what this will allow us to do, it'll allow us to place greens on this input that goes underneath, and those will come out and fill up the inside of the track. As you guys can see, it's kind of a simple solution. construction. Once again, we're using a lot of transport belts. They in and of themselves are pretty cheap, and I would suggest using this setup. Now, of course, this can be improved. Pretty much everything in this game can be improved eventually, and of course, we will be improving that in a later video. So if you're interested about seeing a better one of these setups, one that's a bit larger, a bit more advanced, stick around with this series. I'll probably get to it eventually. So anyway, guys, this is my brother's patent pending system. He didn't actually patent it, but I would suggest using this. This is the best one I've found so far. So that's pretty much it for labs. Hopefully you understand how they work now. Obviously, they're very important, and you will need to be working with them throughout the rest of your Factorio survival. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe if you want to see some more, and I will see you all later.